They called me greedy over one room, but that day when Officer Martinez looked at my family and said your daughter was the victim of identity theft all along, everything changed. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of our childhood home, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that had witnessed decades of family memories. I sat at the edge of the old leather couch, my hands folded in my lap, watching my family circle around me like vultures preparing for a feast. The air was thick with tension and disappointment, heavy with the weight of accusations that had been building for months. My mother stood by the fireplace, her arms crossed, shaking her head in that way she did when she was deeply disappointed in one of us. My father paced behind the dining room table, his footsteps echoing through the house with each frustrated step. My two older brothers sat across from me, their faces wearing identical expressions of disgust and disbelief. The stack of legal documents scattered across the coffee table seemed to mock me, each page representing another reason why my family believed I was tearing our legacy apart. This was supposed to be a simple family meeting about selling the house, but it had turned into a trial where I was both defendant and sole suspect. The room felt smaller than it ever had before, suffocating under the weight of their collective judgment. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, a sound that seemed to echo the chaos brewing inside our walls. The smell of my mother's morning coffee still lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of better times when we all sat together without lawyers and accusations between us. Before I share what really happened that day, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how my story reaches people who understand family betrayal. Sometimes the people closest to us are the quickest to believe the worst about who we are. My mother cleared her throat, breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah, we need to talk about your behavior regarding the house sale. Her voice carried that tone I remembered from childhood, the one that meant I was in serious trouble and there would be no negotiating my way out of it. My father stopped pacing and turned to face me, his weathered hands gripping the back of a dining room chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. We have been patient with you for months, Sarah, but this has gone too far. Your brothers and I have been trying to handle this sale professionally, but you keep throwing obstacles in our way. Michael, my oldest brother, leaned forward with that condescending smile he had perfected over the years. Sarah, we know this is hard, but Mom and Dad need this money for their retirement. The house is too big for them now, and the market is perfect for selling. You cannot keep holding up this process just because you're attached to your old bedroom. David, my middle brother, nodded in agreement, his voice taking on that patient tone people use when they think they are dealing with a child. We all have memories in this house, Sarah, but we have moved on with our lives. You need to do the same and stop being so selfish about one room. The word selfish hit me like a physical blow, settling in my chest with a familiar ache that had been growing stronger with each family conversation over the past 6 months. My mother walked over to the coffee table and picked up one of the legal documents, waving it in my direction like evidence in a courtroom. The realtor has been calling us constantly because you keep requesting delays and asking for more time to review paperwork. She says she has never had a seller's family member cause so many complications. My father joined in, his voice rising with frustration that had been building for months. We have a cash offer, Sarah. A cash offer that is above asking price, and you are jeopardizing it with all your questions and concerns. What exactly are you looking for in those documents that 3 real estate professionals and 2 lawyers have already reviewed? I tried to speak, tried to explain the discrepancies I had noticed, the strange signatures that did not look right, the phone calls I had been receiving from companies I had never heard of. But my family was not interested in listening to what they saw as paranoid excuses from their problematic youngest daughter. Michael held up his hand to silence me before I could even get a full sentence out. Sarah, we know you work in accounting, but that does not make you a real estate expert or a lawyer. You need to trust the professionals we have hired to handle this transaction. David chimed in with a laugh that held no warmth. She probably thinks she found some conspiracy in the paperwork. Sarah always was the dramatic one in the family, always looking for problems where none exist. My mother sat down in the chair across from me, her expression softening slightly, but her words still carrying the sting of disappointment. Sweetheart, I know change is hard, but you cannot let your emotions cloud your judgment. We are a family, and families make decisions together. Right now, you're the only one standing in the way of what everyone else agrees is the right choice. The room felt like it was closing in on me as I listened to my family paint me as the villain in a story I knew was more complicated than they realized. My father resumed his pacing, his voice taking on that lecturing tone he used when he wanted to make sure his point was absolutely clear. Your mother and I raised you children to think about family first, to consider what is best for everyone, not just yourselves. Right now, Sarah, you are not thinking about family. You are thinking about your own attachment to material things, and that is not the daughter we raised. The accusations kept coming like waves, each one washing over me with increasing intensity. Michael pulled out his phone and started scrolling through what I assumed were messages from the realtor or lawyer. Sarah, I have 17 missed calls from Patricia about this sale. 17 calls because you requested another extension to review documents that have already been reviewed by professionals. Do you understand how embarrassing this is for our family? David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where we used to play as children. The buyer is getting impatient, and honestly, I do not blame them. If I were trying to purchase a house and one family member kept creating drama, I would walk away and find a different property. My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled back instinctively, the gesture feeling more like manipulation than comfort. Sarah, honey, I need you to explain to me what you think you are protecting by fighting this sale. Your childhood bedroom? The house where you learned to ride your bicycle? These are just things, sweetheart. Memories live in our hearts, not in buildings. My father stopped pacing and sat down heavily in his recliner, the chair creaking under his weight and frustration. We have been planning this sale for over a year, Sarah. Your mother, and I want to buy a smaller place in that retirement community near the lake. We want to travel while we still can, spend time with our grandchildren, enjoy the golden years we worked so hard to earn. But we cannot do any of that if our own daughter sabotages our plans because she cannot let go of the past. The weight of their disappointment settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat I could not remove. I had been carrying this burden for months, watching my family's trust in me erode with each question I raised about the sale, each concern I voiced about the documentation, each request I made for more time to review the complex legal paperwork. Michael sat back down and fixed me with a stare that reminded me of every childhood argument where he had used his status as the oldest to make me feel small and wrong. Sarah, you have been the problem child in this family since you were 16. Always questioning authority, always thinking you know better than everyone else, always creating drama where none needs to exist. This house sale is just the latest example of your need to be the center of attention, even when it hurts the people who love you most. David nodded in agreement, his voice taking on that pseudo-therapeutic tone he had developed since his divorce. Sarah has always had issues with change and control. Remember when she refused to attend cousin Jenny's wedding because she did not approve of the venue? Or when she boycotted Christmas dinner because she disagreed with Dad's political opinions? This is the same pattern of behavior, just with higher stakes. My mother looked at me with eyes that held more sadness than anger, which somehow made her words hurt even more. I keep asking myself where your father and I went wrong in raising you, Sarah. Your brothers understand family loyalty and compromise, but you seem to think that your individual feelings matter more than collective family decisions. But what they did not know, what I could not make them understand despite months of trying, was that I had been protecting them from something they could not see. The phone calls that started 6 months ago, always when I was alone, always from companies claiming I owed money for accounts I had never opened. The credit card statements that arrived at my apartment for cards I had never applied for, cards that had been used to make purchases across the country while I was sitting in my office working late into the night. The strange signatures on some of the house sale documents that looked like mine, but felt wrong when I studied them closely, like someone had been practicing my handwriting, but had not quite mastered the subtle loops and curves that made it uniquely mine. I had spent sleepless nights researching identity theft, learning about real estate fraud, discovering how criminals could use personal information to manipulate property sales for their own benefit. The more I learned, the more concerned I became about our family's transaction, but every attempt to share my worries was met with eye rolls and accusations of paranoia. My family saw my questions as obstacles and my concerns as selfishness, never realizing that I was trying to protect them from something that could destroy everything they had worked to build. Michael pulled out a folder from his briefcase and spread more documents across the coffee table, each page representing another step in a process that made my stomach churn with unease. Look at all this paperwork, Sarah. Look at how much time and money we have already invested in this sale. The inspection, the appraisal, the legal fees, the realtor commissions. Every day you delay this sale costs our family money and credibility. David joined his brother at the coffee table, pointing to various signatures and dates on the documents. We have been working with Patricia for 8 months to get to this point. She has shown this house to dozens of potential buyers, and we finally have someone willing to pay full asking price with cash. But now you want to throw all that away because you have some paranoid feelings about paperwork that has already been verified by professionals. My father leaned forward in his recliner, his voice carrying the weight of decades of disappointment in his youngest daughter. Sarah, I am going to ask you one more time to explain exactly what you think is wrong with this sale. And I want specific details, not vague feelings or conspiracy theories. What exactly do you think these professionals have missed that you have discovered? I opened my mouth to explain about the credit reports, about the accounts opened in my name, about the signatures that looked almost right but not quite perfect. But before I could speak, my mother interrupted with a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Sarah, we cannot keep doing this dance where you hint at problems without providing real evidence. If you have legitimate concerns, present them clearly. If you are just scared of change, admit that so we can help you work through your emotions. But we cannot keep allowing your fears to control our family's future. The room fell silent except for the sound of my father's fingers drumming against the arm of his recliner, a nervous habit he had developed over the years whenever he was trying to control his temper. Michael stood up and walked to the fireplace, his back to me as he spoke in that controlled voice he used when he was trying to remain professional despite his frustration. Sarah, I am going to be very direct with you because I think you need to hear this clearly. Your behavior over the past 6 months has been selfish, destructive, and frankly embarrassing to our family. We have given you multiple opportunities to explain your concerns, and you have provided nothing but vague worries and paranoid suspicions. David sat down next to me on the couch, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that made me feel like I was 12 years old again. Sarah, I think you need to consider the possibility that your resistance to this sale is not about protecting the family, but about your own inability to accept change and move forward with your life. You have always been the one who struggled with transitions, who held on to the past longer than the rest of us. This house represents your childhood, your security, your connection to a time when life felt simpler and safer. But holding on to that connection is hurting everyone else in the family, and that is not fair. My mother reached across the coffee table and took my hands in hers, her touch gentle, but her words firm with maternal authority. Sweetheart, sometimes being part of a family means making sacrifices for the greater good. Sometimes it means trusting that other people have your best interests at heart, even when you do not understand their decisions. Right now, you're asking us to sacrifice our future, our retirement, our dreams, because you cannot let go of one room in one house. That is not the loving, generous daughter I raised, and I need you to find your way back to being that person. The weight of their collective judgment pressed down on me like a physical force, making it hard to breathe in the room that had once felt like the safest place in the world. My father stood up from his recliner and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where he had taught all of us to throw a baseball and ride bicycles. Sarah, your mother and I have made our decision. We are selling this house with or without your cooperation. We would prefer to have your blessing and support, but we will not allow your fears to derail our plans any longer. Michael turned away from the fireplace and faced me directly, his expression serious and final. We have scheduled the closing for next Friday morning at 10 o'clock. You can be there to support your family, or you can stay home and nurse your grievances, but this sale is happening either way. David squeezed my shoulder in what I think was meant to be a gesture of comfort, but felt more like a warning. Sarah, I hope you will think carefully about the choice you are making here. You can choose to be part of this family's future, or you can choose to remain stuck in the past. But you cannot choose both, and you cannot force the rest of us to stay stuck with you. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the conversation continued in circles, with my family taking turns explaining why I was wrong, why my concerns were unfounded, why my resistance was selfish and destructive. They painted a picture of me as the problem child who had always been difficult, always been dramatic, always been unable to see beyond her own narrow perspective. They reminded me of every time I had questioned their decisions, every time I had stood up for my own beliefs, every time I had refused to simply go along with what everyone else wanted. In their version of the story, I was the villain who was tearing the family apart over something as trivial as attachment to a childhood bedroom. They could not see that I was trying to save them from something much more dangerous than losing a house full of memories. But what I knew, what I had been trying to tell them for months, was that something was very wrong with this sale. The phone calls in the middle of the night from debt collectors looking for accounts I had never opened. The credit card statements for cards I had never applied for, cards that someone was using to make purchases in my name across multiple states. The bank letters about loans I had never taken out, mortgages I had never signed for, financial obligations that appeared on my credit report like ghosts from a life I had never lived. Every piece of documentation I reviewed for the house sale contained small discrepancies that individually seemed insignificant, but together painted a picture of systematic fraud that made my hands shake and my heart race with anxiety. I had spent months quietly investigating, researching, trying to understand what was happening to our family, but every attempt to share my discoveries was dismissed as paranoia and selfishness. The worst part was watching my family's trust in me erode with each passing day, seeing them bond together in their shared frustration with their difficult youngest daughter, who could not just be grateful and cooperative like a normal person. My mother stopped calling me for our weekly conversations. My father stopped asking about my job and my life when we talked on the phone. Michael and David started having family discussions without including me, making decisions about our parents' future without considering my input or concerns. I became the outsider in my own family, the problem that everyone had to work around, the obstacle that stood between them and their dreams of a comfortable retirement filled with travel and grandchildren and the peace they had earned after decades of hard work and sacrifice. But I could not give up, even as my family's frustration grew and their patience disappeared, because I knew that something terrible was happening in the shadows of our lives. Someone had been using my identity, my information, my name to build a financial empire that could destroy everything my parents had worked to create. The house sale was not just about letting go of childhood memories or accepting change or learning to compromise for the good of the family. It was about protecting them from a fraud so sophisticated and destructive that it could leave them homeless and penniless in their golden years, wondering how they had lost everything they had spent their lives building. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late September, my phone rang while I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly reports for the accounting firm where I worked. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, and completely unexpected. "This is Officer Martinez with the County Fraud Investigation Unit. We need to speak with you and your family about some irregularities we have discovered in connection with your recent property transaction." My heart started beating so fast I could hear it in my ears, and my hands began to shake as I gripped the phone tighter. Officer Martinez explained that they had been investigating a sophisticated identity theft ring that had been targeting families with valuable real estate, and our house sale had triggered several red flags in their system. He asked if my family could meet with him the following morning to discuss what they had discovered, and I agreed with a mixture of terror and vindication that made me feel dizzy and nauseous at the same time. As I hung up the phone and stared at the stack of documents on my desk, I realized that everything was about to change. My family was about to learn that their difficult, paranoid, selfish youngest daughter had been trying to protect them from something that could have destroyed their lives. The room that they thought I was fighting over was never really about nostalgia or inability to change or childish attachment to the past. It was about the fraudulent signatures, the stolen identity, the elaborate scheme that someone had constructed using my name and information to steal our family's most valuable asset. Tomorrow, when we sat in that police station conference room and Officer Martinez explained what his investigation had uncovered, my family would finally understand that I had not been the problem after all. I called my mother immediately after hanging up with Officer Martinez, my hands still trembling as I dialed the familiar number that I had memorized as a child. "Mom, I need you to gather everyone for a meeting tomorrow morning. The police want to speak with our entire family about the house sale." Her response was immediate and filled with the exasperation that had become her default tone whenever she spoke to me. "Sarah, what have you done now? What kind of trouble have you created that requires police involvement?" I tried to explain that I had not created any trouble, that the police had contacted me, but she interrupted before I could finish my explanation. "We will discuss this tonight when your father gets home from work. I hope you realize that if you have somehow sabotaged the sale with your paranoid theories, there will be serious consequences for our family relationships." That evening, I drove to my childhood home with a heart full of anxiety and anticipation, knowing that this might be the last time I would walk through those doors as the family disappointment, the problem child who could never just accept things as they were. The house looked exactly the same as it had that morning when they had all gathered to lecture me about my selfishness and inability to compromise. The porch light cast the same warm glow across the front steps where I had sat as a teenager, dreaming about my future and planning my escape from a town that felt too small for my ambitions. The maple tree in the front yard had turned brilliant shades of red and orange, its leaves scattered across the lawn like confetti celebrating a change of seasons that felt symbolic of the transformation about to occur in our family dynamic. My father answered the door with an expression that mixed disappointment with curiosity, his weathered face showing the strain of months of family conflict over what he still believed was my selfish attachment to material possessions. "Sarah, your mother told me about the police call. I need you to explain exactly what kind of mess you have created with your resistance to this house sale. Michael and David are already here, and we're all very concerned about what this means for our family's reputation in this community." I followed him into the living room where my family had reassembled in the same configuration as that morning, but now their expressions carried an additional layer of worry, mixed with their familiar frustration and disappointment in their youngest daughter. My mother sat in her usual chair by the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap in a gesture I recognized from childhood as her attempt to maintain composure when she was deeply upset. "Sarah, I need you to be completely honest with us about what you have done. Did you contact the police about our house sale? Did you file some kind of complaint or report that could jeopardize this transaction?" Michael stood by the dining room table with his arms crossed, his expression showing the controlled anger he had perfected during his years as a corporate manager. "If you have sabotaged the sale after everything we discussed this morning, Sarah, I do not know how we can continue to have a relationship with you." David paced near the window, his nervous energy filling the room as he voiced the concerns that were probably running through everyone's mind. What if the buyers find out about police involvement? What if this destroys the sale and we lose our cash offer? What if word gets around town that our family is involved in some kind of legal trouble? I tried to explain that I had not contacted the police, that they had contacted me, that there was an ongoing investigation that involved our family's transaction. But my words seemed to bounce off their preconceived notions about my character and motivations like raindrops on a windshield. My father shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying decades of disappointment in his youngest child's inability to just be normal and cooperative like other people's daughters. "Sarah, I find it very hard to believe that the police just randomly decided to investigate our perfectly legitimate house sale. Someone had to have contacted them, someone had to have raised concerns or filed complaints, and you are the only person in this family who has been fighting this transaction from the beginning." What they did not know, what I had been trying to tell them for months without success, was that my resistance to the house sale had begun 6 months earlier when I started receiving phone calls that changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. The first call came on a Tuesday evening while I was cooking dinner in my small apartment, preparing the simple meal of pasta and salad that had become my routine after long days at the accounting firm. The voice on the other end was professional but insistent, a debt collector looking for Sarah Mitchell who owed $3,000 on a credit card that had been opened in my name at a store I had never visited in a city where I had never lived. I hung up that first call thinking it was a mistake, some mix-up in the credit reporting system that would resolve itself with a simple phone call to the credit card company. But the calls kept coming, day after day, week after week, each one revealing another account, another debt, another financial obligation that existed in my name, but had nothing to do with my actual life. A car loan for a vehicle I had never purchased, insurance policies for properties I had never owned, utility accounts for addresses where I had never lived, medical bills for treatments I had never received. Each revelation felt like discovering that someone else had been living my life in parallel, using my identity to build a complex financial empire that was completely invisible to me, but devastatingly real to everyone else. I spent sleepless nights researching identity theft, learning about the sophisticated networks of criminals who could steal someone's personal information and use it to create entire alternate identities for financial gain. The more I learned, the more frightened I became, not just for myself but for my family and the house sale that seemed to be moving forward without anyone noticing the subtle signs of fraud that were becoming obvious to me with each document I reviewed. The signatures that looked almost like mine but contained tiny variations that suggested someone had been practicing my handwriting. The addresses that were slightly wrong, phone numbers that had one digit changed, social security numbers that matched mine but appeared on accounts I had never authorized. My family's house sale was not happening in isolation from this identity theft. It was part of it, connected to it in ways that made my stomach churn with anxiety every time I looked at the legal documentation. Someone had been using my stolen identity to establish credibility, to create a financial profile that could be leveraged for increasingly ambitious fraud schemes. The house sale was the biggest prize in a game that had been building for months, possibly years, and I was the only person who could see the connection between the strange phone calls and the family transaction that everyone else saw as routine. But every attempt I made to explain these connections to my family was met with eye rolls and accusations of paranoia. They saw my concerns as evidence of my lifelong inability to accept change and compromise, my tendency to create drama where none existed, my selfish attachment to childhood memories that was preventing them from moving forward with their retirement dreams. They could not see that I was trying to protect them from losing everything they had worked to build over decades of marriage and hard work and careful financial planning. The identity theft had started small, with minor credit card accounts and utility bills that created a foundation of legitimate-looking financial activity in my name. But it had grown more sophisticated over time, expanding into larger loans and more complex financial instruments that could be used as collateral for even bigger schemes. The house sale represented the culmination of months of careful preparation, a transaction that would net the criminals hundreds of thousands of dollars while leaving my family with nothing but legal problems and financial devastation that could destroy their golden years. I had spent months trying to trace the fraud, working late into the night to understand how someone had gained access to my personal information and used it to create this elaborate alternate identity. I contacted credit reporting agencies, filed dispute claims for accounts I had never opened, spoke with bank representatives who seemed confused by my insistence that I was not responsible for debts that appeared legitimate on their systems. Every step of the investigation revealed new layers of sophistication in the fraud, new evidence that someone with considerable skill and resources had been systematically stealing my identity for criminal purposes that extended far beyond simple credit card theft. The hardest part was conducting this investigation alone, without the support or understanding of my family, who saw my questions about the house sale as selfish obstacles rather than legitimate concerns about potential fraud. I could not make them understand that my resistance was not about attachment to my childhood bedroom or inability to accept change, but about protecting them from criminals who were using my stolen identity as a weapon against everything our family had built together. Every family meeting about the house sale became more frustrating as I tried to point out discrepancies in the documentation without revealing the full scope of what I suspected about the identity theft. I asked questions about signatures that looked suspicious, addresses that seemed incorrect, phone numbers that did not match our family's records. But my questions were dismissed as nitpicking, my concerns were labeled as paranoia, and my resistance was interpreted as selfishness that was preventing my parents from enjoying the retirement they had earned through decades of hard work. Officer Martinez had explained during our brief phone conversation that the Fraud Investigation Unit had been tracking a sophisticated identity theft ring that specialized in real estate fraud, using stolen personal information to manipulate property sales for criminal profit. Our house sale had triggered multiple red flags in their monitoring system, patterns that suggested someone was using fraudulent documentation to facilitate a transaction that could leave my family legally and financially devastated. The investigation had been ongoing for several months, running parallel to my family's growing frustration with my questions and concerns about the sale. As I sat in my childhood living room that evening, looking at the faces of my family members who still believed I was the problem that needed to be solved, I realized that tomorrow's meeting with Officer Martinez would change everything. The police investigation would reveal that every concern I had raised about the house sale had been legitimate, that every question I had asked about suspicious documentation had been necessary, that every delay I had requested had been protecting our family from financial destruction. My mother looked at me with eyes that held more sadness than anger, her voice soft but firm as she made what felt like a final plea for honesty and cooperation. "Sarah, tomorrow when we meet with this police officer, I need you to tell the truth about what you have done. If you have created problems for our family because of your inability to accept the sale, we need to know so we can figure out how to fix the damage. If you have filed false reports or made accusations that are not based in reality, we need to understand the extent of the legal trouble you may have created for all of us." My father nodded in agreement, his expression showing the weight of months of family conflict that had taken a toll on everyone's emotional well-being. "Sarah, regardless of what happens tomorrow, I want you to know that your behavior over the past 6 months has disappointed your mother and me more than any other challenge we have faced as parents. We raised you to think about family first, to consider how your actions affect other people, to be honest and straightforward in your communication with the people who love you most. Your resistance to this house sale has violated all of those values, and I hope that whatever happens tomorrow will help you understand the impact of your choices on our family relationships." Michael and David exchanged glances that suggested they had already discussed what they would do if tomorrow's meeting confirmed their worst suspicions about their sister's behavior. Michael spoke first, his voice carrying the authority he had assumed as the oldest child who felt responsible for managing family crises. "Sarah, if this police meeting reveals that you have somehow sabotaged our house sale or created legal problems for our family, there will be consequences for our relationship that may not be reparable." David nodded in agreement, adding his own warning about the potential permanent damage to family bonds that had already been strained to their breaking point. As the evening wore on, my family continued to express their concerns about what tomorrow's meeting might reveal. Their fears about legal trouble and financial problems and community reputation that could be damaged by whatever trouble their youngest daughter had created. They made plans for how to handle different scenarios, discussing damage control strategies and legal consultation options, and ways to minimize the impact on their retirement timeline and financial security. Through it all, they operated on the assumption that I was the source of whatever problem had brought police attention to our family's business, the difficult child who had finally crossed a line from merely selfish behavior into actual destructive action. But I knew that tomorrow, when we walked into that conference room and Officer Martinez began explaining what his investigation had uncovered, everything would change. My family would learn that their daughter had not been creating problems, but had been trying to solve them. They would discover that every concern I had raised had been legitimate, that every question I had asked had been necessary, that every delay I had requested had been protecting them from criminals who were using my stolen identity to steal their life savings and leave them with nothing but legal problems and financial devastation in their golden years. The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock Thursday morning at the county police station, in a conference room that Officer Martinez had reserved for what he described as a complex case involving multiple victims and sophisticated criminal activity. As we prepared to leave my childhood home that Wednesday evening, each family member carrying their own fears and expectations about what the next day would bring, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation that made it impossible to sleep. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come to light, and my family would understand that I had been fighting for them all along. The county police station looked imposing in the early morning light, its brick facade and official signage creating an atmosphere that made my family even more nervous about what they assumed would be a confrontation about my disruptive behavior regarding the house sale. We walked through the glass doors together, but I could feel the invisible distance between myself and my parents, my brothers, the space that months of conflict had created in our relationships. The lobby smelled like industrial cleaning products and coffee, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and uncomfortable plastic chairs arranged in rows that reminded me of a doctor's waiting room where people came to receive bad news about their health or their future. My mother clutched her purse tightly as we approached the reception desk, her knuckles white with tension as she gave our names to the uniformed officer who checked us against a list and directed us to conference room B down the hallway to the left. My father walked beside her with the measured steps of a man preparing for the worst possible news about his youngest daughter's behavior, his face wearing the expression of disappointed resignation that I had seen too many times over the past 6 months. Michael and David flanked me like escorts, ensuring that I would not try to escape before facing the consequences of whatever trouble I had created for our family. Officer Martinez met us at the conference room door, a tall man in his late 40s with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in every detail of our family dynamic as we introduced ourselves and took seats around the rectangular table that dominated the small, windowless room. He had files and documents spread across one end of the table, official-looking paperwork that made my stomach flutter with nervous anticipation about what the next hour would reveal about the case he had been investigating. The walls were painted institutional beige and decorated only with a clock and a framed poster about community safety, creating an atmosphere that felt serious and official and slightly intimidating for a family who had never been involved in any kind of police investigation. My family arranged themselves on one side of the table with me sitting slightly apart, the physical distance reflecting the emotional separation that had grown between us over months of disagreement about the house sale. My mother kept glancing at me with expressions that mixed worry with disappointment, still convinced that whatever had brought us to this room was the result of my inability to accept change and compromise like a mature adult. My father sat with his hands folded on the table, his jaw set in the way that meant he was preparing to hear difficult news and deal with whatever crisis his youngest daughter had created through her selfish and destructive behavior. Officer Martinez settled into his chair and opened the first file, his movements deliberate and professional as he prepared to explain an investigation that would change everything my family believed about the past 6 months of conflict and accusations. Before we begin, I want to assure everyone that you are not in any trouble and that this meeting is part of an ongoing investigation into criminal activity that has affected your family without your knowledge. His words seemed to puzzle my family, who exchanged glances that suggested they were still expecting to hear about my destructive actions rather than learning that we were victims of someone else's crimes. "Sarah," Officer Martinez said, turning to look directly at me, "I want to start by commending you for the concerns you raised about your family's house sale. Your questions about documentation discrepancies and your requests for delays in the closing process have been instrumental in helping us identify and investigate a sophisticated identity theft and real estate fraud scheme that could have cost your family hundreds of thousands of dollars and potentially left them facing serious legal problems." The room fell completely silent as his words sank in, my family's expressions shifting from confusion to shock as they began to understand that their assumptions about my behavior had been completely wrong. Officer Martinez opened another file and pulled out a stack of documents that I recognized as copies of the paperwork I had been questioning for months. The signatures and addresses and phone numbers that had seemed subtly wrong in ways that my family had dismissed as paranoid nitpicking. "These documents," he continued, "contain forged signatures and fraudulent information that were designed to facilitate the illegal transfer of your property to criminal associates who planned to resell it and disappear with the proceeds, while leaving your family responsible for legal complications that could have taken years and tens of thousands of dollars to resolve. Sarah's identity was stolen approximately 8 months ago, and the criminals have been using her personal information to establish credibility and create documentation that would allow them to manipulate this real estate transaction for their own profit. My mother's hand flew to her mouth as the implications of Officer Martinez's explanation began to register. Her eyes wide with shock and growing understanding that everything she had believed about my motivations and behavior had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what was really happening to our family. My father leaned back in his chair as if he had been physically struck, his face pale as he processed the information that his youngest daughter had been trying to protect them from criminals, while he had been accusing her of selfishness and inability to compromise. Michael and David stared at the documents Officer Martinez was displaying, their expressions showing the dawning realization that their sister had been fighting to save their family from financial devastation while they had been united in their frustration with her resistance to the house sale. Officer Martinez continued his explanation, detailing how the criminals had gained access to my personal information and used it to create false accounts, establish fraudulent credit histories, and build the financial profile necessary to manipulate our family's real estate transaction. The phone calls Sarah has been receiving about accounts she never opened, the credit card statements for cards she never applied for, the loan documents for money she never borrowed. These were all part of an elaborate scheme to use her identity as a foundation for increasingly sophisticated financial crimes. The house sale was intended to be the culmination of their efforts, a transaction that would net them several $100,000 while leaving the Mitchell family with legal problems that could have destroyed their retirement security and damaged their credit and reputation for years to come. My family listened in stunned silence as Officer Martinez explained how identity theft rings operate, how they target families with valuable assets, how they use sophisticated techniques to forge documents and manipulate transactions in ways that appear legitimate to real estate professionals and lawyers who are not trained to recognize the subtle signs of fraud that had made me increasingly uncomfortable with our house sale process. Sarah's background in accounting made her more likely to notice discrepancies in documentation that other family members might overlook, and her persistence in questioning these irregularities, despite family pressure to cooperate, has saved your family from becoming victims of a crime that has already affected dozens of other families in this region. Officer Martinez turned to another section of his files and pulled out photographs and documents that showed the extent of the criminal network they had been investigating, evidence of other families who had lost their homes and life savings to similar schemes. Victims who had trusted the process and ignored small warning signs that seemed insignificant at the time, but had been carefully calculated elements of sophisticated fraud operations. Your daughter's questions about signatures that looked almost right but not quite perfect, her concerns about addresses that seemed slightly incorrect, her requests for more time to review documentation that felt somehow wrong to her. These were all legitimate responses to actual evidence of criminal activity that was designed to be difficult to detect until it was too late to prevent the financial devastation. My mother began to cry quietly, tears of shock and guilt and overwhelming relief that her daughter had been protecting them rather than betraying them. Her hands shaking as she reached across the table toward me in a gesture of apology and gratitude that carried the weight of months of misunderstood conflict. My father sat with his head in his hands, processing the magnitude of his misjudgment about my character and motivations, understanding that every accusation he had made about my selfishness and inability to compromise had been not only wrong but cruel in light of what I had actually been trying to accomplish for our family's safety and security. Michael and David looked at each other and then at me, their expressions showing embarrassment and regret as they realized that their united front against their difficult sister had been based on a complete misunderstanding of the situation, that every criticism they had made about my behavior had been unfair and hurtful to someone who had been working alone to protect them from criminals who could have destroyed everything our family had built together. The room felt heavy with the weight of their realization that they had spent months attacking the very person who had been trying to save them from financial ruin. Officer Martinez allowed my family a few moments to absorb the information before continuing with his explanation of how the investigation had unfolded, how they had been tracking this criminal network for over a year, how our family's house sale had appeared on their radar because of patterns that matched previous fraud cases they had investigated. Sarah's resistance to the sale and her questions about documentation had actually helped us identify this case more quickly than we might have otherwise. And her willingness to delay the closing despite family pressure gave us time to investigate thoroughly before any money changed hands or legal documents were signed that could not be easily reversed. The criminals involved in this scheme have been arrested and charged with multiple counts of identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy, Officer Martinez explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of successful law enforcement work that had prevented additional victims from losing their homes and savings to sophisticated financial predators. Your house sale has been suspended pending the completion of our investigation, but I want to assure you that your property is secure and that you will be able to proceed with a legitimate sale when you are ready. Using documentation that has been verified as authentic and working with professionals who have been cleared of any involvement in criminal activity. My family sat in shocked silence for several minutes after Officer Martinez finished his explanation, each of them processing the magnitude of what they had just learned about the past 6 months of family conflict and the real reasons behind my resistance to the house sale that they had interpreted as selfish and destructive behavior. The truth was settling over them like a heavy blanket, the understanding that everything they had believed about my motivations had been wrong, that every accusation they had made had been unfair, that every moment of frustration they had expressed had been directed at someone who had been trying to protect them from criminals. My mother was the first to speak, her voice shaky with emotion as she looked directly at me for the first time in weeks, without anger or disappointment in her eyes. "Sarah, honey, I am so sorry. I cannot believe that we spent all those months thinking you were being difficult when you were actually trying to save us from losing everything. I do not know how to apologize for not listening to you, for not trusting you, for making you feel like you were alone in this fight when you were actually fighting for all of us." Her words broke something loose in my chest that I had been holding tight for months, the pain of being misunderstood by the people I loved most in the world, the exhaustion of carrying the burden of protecting them while they accused me of trying to hurt them. My father reached across the table and took my hand, his grip firm and warm and full of regret as he struggled to find words that could convey his shame about the way he had treated his youngest daughter during the most difficult period of her life. "Sarah, I have never been more wrong about anything in my life than I was about your behavior regarding this house sale. You saved our family from losing everything we worked to build, and instead of thanking you and supporting you, we made you feel like the enemy. I do not know if I can ever forgive myself for the things I said to you, for the way I questioned your character and your love for this family when you were demonstrating both every single day through your refusal to give up on protecting us." Michael stood up from his chair and walked around the table to where I was sitting, his expression showing a mixture of embarrassment and admiration as he processed the full implications of what Officer Martinez had revealed about my months of investigation and resistance. "Sarah, I owe you an apology that is bigger than anything I know how to express. I called you selfish and dramatic and accused you of caring more about material possessions than family relationships, when the truth was that you were the only one who cared enough about our family's future to fight for it when the rest of us were ready to sign our lives away to criminals. You saved us, and instead of recognizing your strength and intelligence and dedication, we punished you for it." David joined his brother beside my chair, his own expression showing the shame of someone who had badly misjudged a situation and hurt someone he loved through his ignorance and impatience. "Sarah, I keep thinking about all the times I told you to trust the professionals and stop asking so many questions, when your questions were the only thing standing between our family and financial disaster. You were smarter than all the lawyers and real estate agents and experts we hired, and you were braver than any of us because you kept fighting even when your own family was lined up against you. I cannot imagine how lonely and frustrating it must have been to know what you knew and not be able to make us understand." Officer Martinez gathered his files and prepared to leave us alone to process what we had learned, but before he stood up, he looked directly at me with an expression of professional respect that felt like vindication after months of being treated like a problem that needed to be managed. "Sarah, in my 23 years of investigating financial crimes, I have rarely seen someone with the persistence and attention to detail that you demonstrated throughout this case. Your refusal to be intimidated by family pressure, your commitment to asking questions that other people found inconvenient, your willingness to be seen as difficult rather than allow your family to become victims of fraud. These are the qualities that prevent criminals from succeeding in their efforts to destroy innocent people's lives. After Officer Martinez left the conference room, my family and I sat together in a silence that felt completely different from the tense, accusatory quiet that had characterized our interactions for months. This silence was full of processing and understanding and the beginning of healing relationships that had been damaged by misunderstanding and false assumptions about motivations and character. My mother moved to the chair beside me and put her arm around my shoulders, a gesture of comfort and support that I had not received from her in longer than I could remember. We drove home together that afternoon, but the conversation in the car was unlike any family discussion we had shared in months. Instead of accusations and frustration and attempts to convince me to change my position on the house sale, there were apologies and expressions of gratitude and acknowledgments of how wrong they had been about my character and motivations. My parents talked about how proud they were of my intelligence and persistence, how grateful they were that I had refused to give up despite their lack of support, how ashamed they were of the way they had treated me during the most difficult period of my life. Michael and David spent the drive home expressing their regret about the things they had said about my inability to compromise and think about family interests, acknowledging that I had been thinking about family interests more clearly than anyone else and that my refusal to compromise had saved them from disaster. They talked about how they had mistaken my strength for stubbornness, my intelligence for paranoia, my love for selfishness, and how they would never again dismiss my concerns without taking the time to understand what I was seeing that they might be missing. That evening, we gathered again in the living room where so many difficult conversations had taken place over the past 6 months, but this time the atmosphere was completely transformed by the truth that had emerged during our meeting with Officer Martinez. My family looked at me with expressions of respect and gratitude rather than frustration and disappointment, and for the first time in months, I felt like I belonged in the room where I had grown up, surrounded by people who loved me and believed in my judgment and valued my contributions to our collective well-being. My mother made my favorite dinner that night, a gesture of apology and celebration that tasted like forgiveness and acceptance and the restoration of family bonds that had been strained but not broken by months of misunderstanding. We talked about how the experience had changed all of us, how it had taught us about the importance of listening to each other even when we do not understand each other's concerns, how it had demonstrated that sometimes the person who seems to be causing problems is actually the person who is trying to solve them. The house sale was eventually completed 6 months later, after the criminal investigation was finished and new documentation was prepared and verified by law enforcement officials who ensured that every signature was authentic and every detail was correct. My parents were able to purchase their retirement home near the lake and began the travel and relaxation they had planned for their golden years. But they never forgot that their dreams had been preserved by the daughter they had almost lost faith in during the darkest period of our family's history. Michael and David both called me regularly after that day, not just for family business or holiday coordination, but to ask my opinion about financial decisions and legal documents and any situation where my attention to detail and willingness to ask difficult questions might help them avoid problems or make better choices. They had learned that my different perspective was a strength rather than a weakness, that my tendency to notice things other people missed was a gift that could benefit everyone if they were willing to listen and learn from what I discovered. My relationship with my parents was stronger after the crisis than it had been before, built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that had been tested and proven through months of difficulty and misunderstanding. They learned to trust my judgment even when they did not understand my reasoning, and I learned to be patient with their need to process information differently than I did, to give them time to come to their own understanding of situations that seemed obvious to me from the beginning. The experience taught our entire family that love sometimes looks like conflict, that protecting people you care about sometimes requires standing against them when they are making decisions that could hurt them. That being right is less important than being willing to fight for what matters even when you have to fight alone. We learned that family loyalty sometimes means questioning family decisions, that unity sometimes requires one person to stand apart from the group. That strength sometimes looks like stubbornness until the truth emerges and reveals the courage that was hidden beneath the surface. Years later, when people ask me about that period of our family's life, I tell them that it taught me the difference between being liked and being loved, between keeping peace and keeping faith, between going along with what everyone wants and standing up for what everyone needs. Sometimes the person who loves you most is the person who refuses to let you make a mistake that could destroy your life, even when that refusal makes them look like the problem that needs to be solved. The room that my family thought I was fighting over was never really about nostalgia or attachment to material possessions or inability to accept change. It was about protecting the people I loved from losing everything they had worked to build, about refusing to let criminals steal our family's future, about being willing to be misunderstood and criticized and isolated if that was what it took to keep my parents safe in their golden years. In the end, the room I was really fighting for was the space in our family where truth could emerge and love could triumph over misunderstanding, and we could all learn to see each other more clearly than we ever had before. Sometimes the person fighting hardest for the family is the one being blamed for tearing it apart. Have you ever been misunderstood when you were trying to help? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes standing alone is the strongest thing you can do for the people you love most.